Shall we start? Hello, my name is Osvaldas. I'm the only guy from Lithuania this year. Are there any Lithuanians in this auditorium? Yeah, lietuviškai kalba, gerai. Okay, nice to know. So I'm going to talk about naming explicitly, just naming and nothing else. No clean code, no duplication, no bad patterns, only this specific thing. And I think it's very much undervalued and underappreciated and also not frequently talked about, at least not frequently enough, right? It's a very peculiar topic for me. I've been wondering about these things for about 15 years of my professional career. So, of course, there's a lot of my own experience and my own preference in this, but also from industry experts like, Uncle Bob and Eric Evans and Nat Price. I read books. I have some practice from my own experience, and it's all in this particular talk. So I hope that you will leave with at least some guidelines of how to improve your own naming habits. And by naming, I mean naming variables and functions and classes and modules. And if not, if you know everything I say, because many things are really basic, we just forget about them, then at least you will have a talk you wish your colleagues would have listened to. That's one of the reasons I do it anyway. Okay. Can anyone say what programming language this is? Just shout out. Ook, yes, thank you. It is an orangutan-friendly programming language. It's a derivative of brainfuck. It was designed specifically to be like as minimal as possible. It has 3 primitive elements, which is ook, and ook. That's it. Curiously, out of these 3, you can construct any complexity you like, so it's Turing complete. And it has another thing, which programming languages kind of have to have, 3 things, right? Primitive elements, means of combination, and then means of abstraction. So this it lacks. It has means of combination. You can combine things to achieve things. So you can say ook followed by ook means increment pointed to the right. And double ook means increment the number at the pointer by 1, and so on. So you can do a lot of stuff. In this particular program prints out hello world. It's actually a running program. Then another programming language which also kind of doesn't have really means of abstraction, at least didn't for some time, was the first assembly languages. They had means of combining statements together and like primitive elements, but no way of abstracting them. So it's all at one level of abstraction. And this happens to be ADSAC assembler, one of the first ones. It also prints hello world. But then things changed. At some point, somebody decided, you know what, it would be a good idea to add labels to assemblers. I'm not sure this is the first assembly language to have labels, but one of the first ones. It's Motorola 68000, or some of that series, I think. And it has labels like inch. So what you can do, you can actually label an instruction with some word you just made up. And then you can jump to labels with which were used before, right? So jump ouch sounds awfully like exception handling, although in this case it's not. But it kind of gives you an idea of, that's where it started. And it broke new ground. It also opened the whole Pandora's box, because it introduced one of the 2 hardest problems in computer science, which is naming things, and that's where this title comes from. The one being cache invalidation, which I'm not talking about, also a hard problem. And then why even bother with names, right? Of course, you all know that having good names and expressing your intent is important, but then why is it important? So very quickly, for one, maybe you want to have less WTFs per minute, which is a good metric of code quality. The less you have, the better. Having good names awfully helps a lot, right? I remember, I know I've been many times in a place where I just look at a function or at a class, and I have no idea what it does. Also, I have an idea what it does, and it turns out to be completely the opposite of what it says it does. So that's one problem. Then we all have heard that actually reading code is an activity we do much more often and much more, we spend much more time on it than writing code. So it would make sense to optimize code for readability, for explicitness, for intent, right? I had no idea it's that much more. So this is not something I made up. This is based on hard data. And this hard data is based on a quote by Robert Martin. Indeed, the ratio of time spent reading versus writing is well over 10 to 1. So 10 times more reading than writing. Of course, that's not hard data, but still. I think your mileage may vary. It still matters. Then you might want to follow the 4 rules of simple design. The second one is the most important if you ignore the tests. So that's clear, expressive, and consistent, and you can't have that without good naming habits. By the way, I have facilitated a lot of code retreats. Has anyone been to a code retreat session? Yeah, a few hands. Okay, cool. So it's, if you don't know, a workshop for programmers, a whole day workshop, where we just sit down and code, we solve the same problem again and again, start from scratch, and we practice these 4 rules of simple design, also test-driven development and pair programming and other things. And what I observe, people have no trouble learning to write tests. They have no trouble finding the application and removing it. If I say write minimal code, which means, for example, don't have methods which have more than 3 lines of code. They do that, no problem. They mostly struggle with naming. So that's where the hard part comes in. Let's break down what is a good name. Let's start from the obvious, the easiest part. How long a name should be. Are short names better? Are long names better? What do you think? So these are the shortest names I could find in each of the 3 platforms. Are these good names? Is the URL a good name? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an abbreviation, but it's awfully well known what it means, right? What it stands for. How about SR? Any .NET developers here? I used to be one. Yeah, quite a few. What does SR stand for? Really? I have no idea. I have developed in .NET for 4 years. I have no idea what it stands for. So, not a good name, but a short one. How about DL in PHP? Any PHP developers? Yay. What does DL do? No. I think it's something to do with dynamic loading a library. I might be wrong. So yeah, short names can be good or bad. It depends. How about long names? These at some point, these were the longest names in each of the platforms. This might have changed since when. I'm not sure. But yeah, well, it depends, right? What can you say about the first class name? Well, it's an extension. It extends a parser, a WSDL parser to be precise, right? It extends addressing, which is probably one of the WS star standards, right? And it has to do with member submission. So it's very, very specific. It's not necessarily a bad thing. If all of the essential details you put into a name, none of them are extraneous or, superfluous, then it's a good name. And the other ones as well. I might drop a few words out of there, which may not be essential, but, I don't have anything against long names, and I think they're perfectly fine. So, this is out of the way. I'm not going to talk about length again. Length doesn't matter. What matters is whether there's noise in your names, whether they're good or bad abstractions, the right level of abstraction, and how well do they model the domain. So the rest of this talk is going to be that. Okay. Noise. What is noise? Name string is a noise. This is from clean code. Who does that, really? Who calls their name variable name string? it's obviously noise. Noise is something you don't need. If you remove it, it still conveys the exact same amount of information. So that's noise by definition. But then we don't often think about other kinds of noise, like Hungarian. Okay, nobody does that anymore. How about getters and setters? Is get and set noise? I would argue yes. Like if you want to print out person name, do you say person.name or do you say person.getName? What do you gain by saying person.getName? I don't know. For me, it's noise. For lots of other people as well. And we'll get there afterwards. How about impl suffixes? Kind of obvious, right? If you have an implementation called something impl, what do you name the second implementation? Impl2, that could be it, yeah. Number series naming, always good practice. I prefix on interfaces, that's more from .NET space, but I've seen that in Java as well. It's noise. It doesn't reveal any information apart from the fact that it's an interface. And then in Java especially, but also in other languages, you see a lot of repetition, not just noise. So in red, there's noise, which can be just removed without changing anything. And in blue, there's repetitive code. So all of this is doing something. It's creating operation object, then calling a service to process the balance and returns, gets the amount and checks whether it's negative, right? So all of that could be said in one sentence, whether after debiting 50 euros, I get a balance which is negative. One sentence. Is there any way we can express this one sentence in a single statement in a language? By the way, return also is noise. It just happens that Java does not allow you to return value without saying return. So that's noise implied by, enforced by the language, right? Other languages don't do that. So Vaidas is leader of Vilnius Java user group, a great guy, and he tweeted this once, too much ID teaches us a very bad habit. Okay, we stop reading what we write. And that's true, and that's what I do as well. And I often catch myself, that's quick, I'll just generate getter setters and some constructor. And I'll turn this into some kind of builder or whatever. So it's a bad habit. If we hadn't had so good IDEs, if we were all coding in Notepad, we would write much less code and it would have much less noise, I would argue. So how can we rewrite this? Many ways. One of them like that. What's wrong with this? Balance after debit of 50 euro is negative. That actually reads like a natural language. Shouldn't all code strive to replicate natural language? Not all the time, but it's nice if you can do that, especially if you're working on the domain model, right? Where like business language really matters, whether you implement the requirements correctly or not, you can tell by looking at the code. So try to reduce noise. And then, very important, try to have better abstractions. I like this quote. Brad Fitzpatrick, who is the developer of LiveJournal, right? And he also developed Memcached and other things. So he says there are all these beautiful abstractions that are backed by shit. And I mean, he's right. He didn't like abstractions simply because, he did like abstractions, but it's like necessary evil. You kind of have to understand what's going on under the hood. So it would be better if your abstraction were a little bit more transparent. Why does this class exist? I didn't make it up. It's actually from a project I worked on like 6 years ago. It happens to be the single worst abstraction I've seen, probably. And it's bad not because it's long. It's bad because it contains everything I dislike about bad abstractions. So it works with objects. That's nice to know. It processes them. What does processing mean? Doing something with objects, right? And it's a service. What's a service? A class that has no state, maybe, not sure. So if you look at abstraction like that, there's nothing you can infer from the name. And you should, right? If you look at the name, you should automatically imply certain things, what the role is, why would I need to do that, why would I call this abstraction, why does it exist? And if you can't do that, you have to go into the interface for class itself and see what it contains to, well, doesn't help you much. And so you're left with commenting. So you see a command which says, if you want to do XYZ, use this interface. So why don't just call it XYZ? Thank you very much. That would be helpful. Commands are often a sign of bad naming. There's usually a way you can express a command in the code itself. Not always. You can't express extraneous reasoning. Like we had this one customer who just wants this particular feature to work on Fridays every second full moon of a year. And so this is hard to explain in code itself. You need a command for that. But most of the time you can do with code, just with class and method naming and parameters. So abstraction should not be abstract. That's one of the biggest errors I see developers make. If I create an abstraction, well, it's just kind of vague, it's abstraction. But actually they should be as concrete as possible. They should be clear, and they should clearly express the intent of why it exists. And you only use it in this particular narrow context. So embed this context into the name. However, you also can be too specific. Not that I hate long names, right? But is there any way we can improve this? Set rating to 0 when no orders in the last year for a product. What's the intent behind this method? It spells out how it's implemented, right? It takes an order and it finds all the ratings for that. It takes a product, finds all the ratings and all the orders for that product, and then if there were no orders the last year, it resets the rating to 0. So how about reset outdated rating? I took the implementation details and I extracted the word which is hidden behind them, which is the actual meaning, the business intent of why it exists. It's an outdated rating, I want to reset it. What exactly it means to be outdated, that's an implementation detail. Okay? So you can be too specific in your name as well. Which means we always should strive to find the right level of abstraction, whether it's as abstract as a service or as concrete as Active Directory authentication. And that's always context dependent. That's why it's very hard to give recipes of how to name things. In one's level of abstraction, you would say something is a user authentication because that's what you care about. You don't care that it's an LDAP authentication, for example. And in another concept, in another context, you have to be more specific than that or less specific than that. So that's one of the ways you can experiment, going up and down. Go up and see, does this make it better? No, it's too specific. I'm going up then. Okay. So if you name an abstraction, always try to find the role from the perspective of whoever is using that abstraction, the consumer. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory. Then I'm not going to go through all of the principles of object-oriented programming, but the really important one here is single responsibility. One reason to change. Okay, if you can't find a good name, it very often means that either you have too many responsibilities hiding in there and you should split it, or it's so vague there's no one clear responsibility and you should just rethink it altogether. Which brings me to eierlegende Wollmilchsau. It's a thing in German folklore, which is like an all-purpose animal. It can do eggs, it can do milk, it can do wool, you can eat it, right? It's very useful. Of course, we as programmers don't like words like that. We don't like spelling out all of the features our class contains, just listing them in the name. Although that actually would be a good practice because it would force you to see immediately that these features should be split into multiple classes or multiple methods. But we are, capable and we are better than that, and we can think of abstractions like farm service, which immediately encapsulates everything, right? That's like kind of fixes the problem. Now we can put even more behavior into this class, and it would still be a farm service. Isn't that great? And that is a weasel word. I love these. A weasel word, defined by Wikipedia, is like a word which doesn't really mean anything, but it pretends or sounds as if it meant something. And there are many examples of that in OOP, at least in the code I've seen. Service, manager, handler, processor, utils, helper, data, DTO, info, item, details, object, custom, default, abstract, base, simple, smart. Have you seen smart code? I have. Yeah. In Spring Service, there were 2 implementations of an interface, and one of them was simple, the other one was default. I can't remember, was it like message dispatch or something? Message listener, okay, thank you. A guy from Spring Framework. He knows. I could never decide which one I should use. Should I use the simple one or the default one? Like, the name doesn't tell me that. So, if you replace these weasel words with whatever, you get more or less the same amount of information. So they are interchangeable. So try to avoid them. It's hard to avoid them because they are so ingrained in what we do. But try to find a better word for everything. Okay, if you say something is account processor, what does it really do with that account? Is it like account list, or is it account life cycle or something else? What does it do with account? As Yoda said a long time ago in a galaxy far away, bad naming leads to bad choices, and bad choices lead to bad design, which leads further to bad naming. And this is a vicious cycle. If you have bad names, people will be making poor decisions. They will be putting behavior to classes where they don't belong. That will create even worse design, which will lead to even worse naming, and the circle goes around. There are many ways you can break the cycle, and by turning it into a virtuous cycle. You can start with design, you can start with choices, you can start with naming. I find that starting with naming is the best, like the easiest one, actually. If you just think of a better name, that will immediately lead to better choices by other developers, which will improve the design. So it doesn't magically work, but it's the simplest thing you can do. Just improve the names, one by little. It will somehow magically, well, almost magically, in the long run, if you apply it diligently, make your design simpler and better. Doer classes, another random thought. Well, I don't have a strong opinion about classes which are named with ER or OR suffix, like sender, messenger, processor. Processor is bad in its own right, but if something is called do this, then the class will be named this doer. And that's a sign that object-oriented programming is not always the right approach. Very often, if you apply OOP patterns to the letter, and you strive for single responsibility and interface segregation and so on, you will end up with classes and interfaces which have just one method. And how do you call such a class or interface? Well, you will be tempted to call it by the method, right? Something doer.do something. That's natural. And there's no good workaround it in general. It's just saying that, functional programming or having pure functions often makes sense. So you don't have to put everything inside objects unless the language forces you to. But if it does force you, you can still, think about better abstractions, like where do I send my SMS messages through? Maybe it's a channel. Maybe it's a proxy or something like that. Or maybe it's just a function. If your language does support pure or free functions, use them. You don't have to put everything inside a class. And then you will have less of a headache thinking of good names. And lastly, domain modeling. So that's mostly based on domain-driven design. Who has read domain-driven design? Who has finished it? 3 guys? Okay. Yeah, it's a long and weighty book, but it's a good one. So I haven't finished the very last chapter, but I have finished everything up until that point. It's still a lot of good advice. So Eric Evans there suggests that we should describe our scenarios out loud. If we just read the code we write, just read it or rephrase it, it's immediately obvious what is cumbersome about it. It's immediately obvious what doesn't sound right. When you type it in, especially if you use autocompletion in IDE, which everybody does, you don't notice what's wrong with the code. If you're working in a domain part of your application where it should always reflect what's going on in the actual business domain, then it's very important that you read it out loud. And then you can actually use that to come up with better or alternative designs. So you should say, when user changes the username, we set username and user data and save it by user DAO. I just read out loud the code which I have, and it doesn't sound right. If you instead say, when user changes its username, we change username in user repository. Well, a little better. I could also say, when user changes its username, we store a username changed event to event queue. And again, these are not none of these is the best design, but you can iterate the designs just by, saying them out loud. And by that, you can choose the best one, which sounds, less cumbersome. Has somebody heard of a rule that all classes must be nouns? All class names have to be nouns. Okay. Well, I have worked on projects where that was not the case, and it worked perfectly well. So how about commands? Commands are not really nouns. Command objects are really verbs. So just call it, send data or promote customer. That's the class name. Why not? Because that's what it does. How about events? Events are not nouns. Events are something that happened in the past. They are verbs. So just say, customer created. It doesn't have to be a noun. You don't have to call it customer created event or create customer command just because somebody mandates it should be, a noun. And one of the most important things you should always, especially if you're working in the central part, the domain part of your application, you should always listen to what the domain experts are saying and how they're speaking, and try to translate that language to the diagrams, to documentation, and also to your own code. That's kind of a given. But still, very often I find myself using technical terms in my code just because I'm used to them, but that's not something the experts use. If you do that, your code will reveal intention. So if you see something like account operation service, well, what does it do? Why? Okay, the question is why. Why would you call it? Why would you put new behavior into it? If you take a look inside of it, you will see that it, for example, does some credit operations and some debit operations, does something with them. Okay, so your first approximation is a credit and debit log, if it stores them somewhere. Okay, and then you listen to domain experts, to how they speak, and how do they call a credit and debit log? They call it a ledger, so why not just call it a ledger? So that's one of the exercises you can do to extract that intent from the name. And I often use thesaurus because I'm not well versed in dictionary, and I'm not a native English speaker, and I'm not well versed in financial dictionary. So I use that. I talk to experts for inspiration, and that is actually pretty useful. Yeah. One of the last guidelines, The path encapsulation will be lost if developers must consider implementation details. Well, we kind of talked about it a little bit, right? So if you see a name, immediately there should be no surprises. Get result. What does it do? You play the same game. You look into the implementation. If you're refactoring old code, what do? You see what it actually does, and you first can just name the steps that this method is performing into the name. So you say, okay, we get the sum of debits and credits. That's immediately better. And then you try to find a name in the domain which means whatever this is doing. So what is the sum of debits and credits? That's a balance. So you call it calculate balance or get balance. I don't like get, but no, you can do that as well. And then this becomes intention revealing. Yeah, and that leads to clean code. All right. I think I jumped very fast through all of my slides. Perhaps I was a little bit nervous, and that's why I did it. I don't know. But still, I can say one last thing. How about patterns? Who uses pattern names inside their classes? Like this is a factory, and this is a proxy, and this is a builder. Yeah, okay, many people. I do that as well. I met a guy, I talked to a guy via email. I didn't actually meet him. He's a German guy, and his name is Johannes Hofmeister. It turns out that these weasel words, which I was talking about before, he has the whole article about that, and he's been working on it, and he has a large collection of weasel words which don't mean anything and which are used routinely in software development, and there are like 200 of them. I had 20, 30. And he catalogs them, and he also has an opinion about these pattern names. So he calls it party hats. Whenever a class declares what its role is, but not in terms of business, but in terms of its role within the framework you use, like I'm a factory, and he's a hat with a factory, and I'm a proxy, and there's the hat with a proxy. I'm a builder, and there's the builder. So when you call a code, you don't have to know what technical pattern it implements. What you have to know is why you would use it. Okay, what's the intent behind using it? So I don't really like, and many others I have read don't really like having object-oriented pattern names inside the class names. But this, anyway, was meant to stir some discussion. And to recap quickly, if you want your names to be more intention-revealing and lead to better design, you should always tell a story with your code. Try to make it readable. Read it out loud to see where you fail. And try to reduce the noise words and the weasel words. Always reveal the intention why something exists and why you would want to change it or use it. And use the ubiquitous language, which is also used by your customers or domain experts. And none of this will happen unless you actually invest time in renaming code and restructuring. So I never get it right the first time. Actually, I never get it right, period. Right? So it's always in process of being constantly refactored and improved. So do that, especially with low-hanging fruit. And I think I'm kind of done. I hope this was a little bit controversial, so that I could stir some interesting questions, because people always say, "Oh, we do this in our project, and this seems to be a good practice. Why don't you do that?" So I'm open to questions. You can throw tomatoes at me if you want. I can duck. Yeah.
Anyone? Questions?
Do you ever get stuck in this process when you're trying to find the best naming?
Yes, I often even ping-pong between two names back and forth. I refactor to this name, and then I find, no, really? I should go back to that one because it was better. Yeah. I rarely, if ever, am satisfied with the first name I come up with. And that's natural, because development is iterative, right? Unless you have like waterfall, and you have 100% specification of everything and architecture and design documents, then you can extract names from there and put it in your code. And it will just work and be perfect. That's not how it works. So we are agile and we discover names as we go along. So it's very normal that you will iterate and you will rename and you will refactor and you will restructure. But often that also leads to insight. So if I rename something from account operation service to a ledger, it somehow magically finds a place in my domain. Okay, so maybe I thought this was some kind of repository or something, but actually it's now like a core domain object, and then it will attract behavior which is related to it, or it will repel behavior which does not belong to it. So having a good name is really powerful. Finding it is not easy, but it's worth it.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I'd like to describe something and then ask if you've got some very terse wording that I can use to correct the thinking of the people I believe are making a mistake. Of course, you might say they're not making a mistake. But did you get the...
Yeah.
I work with a different language type, I suppose, than the kind you've been talking about. Not object-oriented, but straightforwardly procedural, with block structuring, so you can define very short names very locally in such a short amount of code that it's obvious what they are, for example. But there's a universal practice within this language. It's PL SQL in the Oracle database. I don't know who started it, but it's to typically prefix, sometimes suffix, every identifier in a subprogram with its functional role in that strict language sense. Like formal parameter would be called P underscore something for parameter. Typically P in something or P out something, and correspondingly local variables are called L underscore something. And constants, language lets you declare something to be constant, would be C underscore, and so it goes on. Exceptions, E underscore, and other things. And that seems to be a good example of redundancy.
Yeah.
And by the way, I tried to get the point across by taking the Gettysburg Address and prefixing every word in it with pronoun, noun, or verb.
Yeah.
But it didn't seem to make the point. People, were not impressed and couldn't connect that and its cumbersomeness to their source code. Are you with me so far?
Well, yeah.
So I'm just looking for your tersest way. Well, first of all, would you agree with or contradict me in thinking that P underscore, L underscore, C underscore, E underscore is a nuisance?
That would count as a variation of Hungarian notation, I would say. And by that, it's noise, right? There's a reason why it appeared there. Probably there was some limitation in the programming language which did not allow you to express something, or the compiler did not allow you to check some things, and therefore, as a safety guard, these conventions were invented. So it's very hard to tell without me knowing. I did a little bit of PLSQL, but not that much really, and we didn't use such conventions. So I would say it's probably a historical artifact which relies more on habit rather than anything like substantial, why you would really need to do that. So yeah, I relate to that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if your type checker does not check what the length of your array is, and you can, get a seg fault if you get it wrong, then it makes sense to prefix it with ARR8 or something. But that's, as you said, lack of tooling. If you have better tooling, you should adjust your habits accordingly when you have better tooling.
Okay, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So this interface and implementation kind of issue, I would say. Sometimes it's the framework that imposes you kind of the impulse suffix, right? You have always a one-to-one correspondence between interface and implementation, and it doesn't make sense to try to invent the kind of, the implementation it exists only because you need to use dependency injection, right? It doesn't serve any other purpose. So in that case, would you still argue that the impl suffix is useless?
Well, I think you're referring to Spring Framework and its capabilities to proxy or not proxy a class, whether it implements interface or not. Yeah. I don't think it's relevant anymore. I mean, really, Spring could proxy classes and not interfaces for a long time now.
Yes, that is true, but still you may have a preference for using interfaces, right? For instance, in our project, so we discussed that what you said, but the preference remains that there should be a separate interface. In that case,
I mean, you should ask whether your preference gives you any benefit, like. Maybe you, by specifying an interface, you specify a contract which will be mocked out in a test, for example, and you, for some reason, don't want to use cglib in your test to mock out things, right? So there may be a reason for that. You should ask yourself, well, this reason is still relevant, and with current state and current tools, you still have to do that. We in our Spring project used to do that, and then 3 years ago moved on to just not putting interfaces where they don't matter. Because an interface really is a contract or a role, and it also implies it makes sense to have more than one implementation. If it doesn't make sense to have more than one implementation, then it doesn't make sense to have an interface, in my book.
Okay, thank you.